We move on to the next item on our agenda, which is demand sensing, real-time demand tracking. We have a panel with us, led by, I would like to invite the panelists on Shrey Sharan, Head Integrated Business Planning and Demand, Mondelez. Shrey, can you please? Nimish Jain, National Head Demand and Supply Planning, Colgate Palmolive. Nimish. Vijay Rana, Associate Director Planning and Supply Chain Transformation, Nivea. Welcome, Vijay. Gyandev Bakshi, General Manager Analytics and Pre-Sales Consulting, SS Supply Chain Solutions. Lawrence D'Souza, Global Procurement Shared Services Leader, International Flavors and Fragrances. Arpit Raj, Demand Planning Lead, Godrej Consumer Products. Anandita Ray, DGM Demand Planning, IGM Berkshire India. And to orchestrate the panel, I would like to request Shanmukh Singh.
Hello everyone. Thank you, Grace. Most companies today are ailed by one thing, and we all know what that is: poor forecasts. There are more than one ways to improve it, but today we'll be talking about only one, and that is a technology-based solution, that is demand sensing. The last panel spoke, and even the last speech spoke a lot about planning and technology and how to integrate it, and this has given birth to a very interesting technology called demand sensing. Demand sensing uses real-time data, as we all know it, to sense demand and improve our forecast performance and thus our service level. But discussions around demand planning are full of myths and unformed opinions, and the panel here will try to correct the wrongs and misunderstandings about demand sensing today. The first question of mine is, what is demand sensing? Anyone can take up, but I request the panelists to keep it short, 2 to 3 minutes, please.
Yeah, before we move to demand sensing, let's take a step back and see where we are and how the conventional demand planning practices are evolving, have evolved.
I think that's been discussed.
Yeah, so I think what is the genesis of demand sensing, right? That is appearing from the limitations of the conventional planning practices, right? What those limitations are. We are living in a world wherein, and we have discussed this, the history is distorted, right? We look at 4 or 5 years in the past, we have events of COVID, we had events of demonetization, we had events of GST, which are black swan events and may not find precedence or may not be repeated in the future. Right? What we are also looking at is the importance of our short-term and long-term forecast is now very different. Our short-term forecast is what will drive scheduling, is what will drive deployment, and eventually will become most important for service. What we are also looking at is granularity. So if at all a national level forecast for an SKU was good enough 5 years back, what we are looking at right now is a far more granular location level, account level forecast. Right? What we are also looking at is the variables that impact forecasting, right, have changed over the years. We can no longer now rely on our historical internal sales data to be the only variable that will influence our future. Right? We discussed of macros, there are far more variables that are in the play right now. And because of these factors, the need for a far more evolved, more integrated, with a shorter cycle planning practice is emerging, which is giving shape to demand sensing. Right? So what we are essentially saying here is that it's a technology-enabled, data-integrated, shorter turnaround cycle, which will help us anticipate, preempt, predict, and take actions, which is what demand sensing aims to do.
I can allow one more panelist to answer this question.
So just to add to what you just mentioned, one is integrated short term, but also we need to remember what works today may not work for tomorrow. What was working yesterday may not work for today. This is really a changing environment. So that needs to be kept in mind. Secondly, what is critical for us here is how close are we to the data that we are getting it. The tools will help us to throw out a lot of analysis, but our confidence on the data is more important, and that goes with our experience and our thought process. And whoever is working on it has to have the accountability. Unless and until that accountability is not there from whom we are collecting the data or who's working on the data, we may not get the right data or the right output. Okay, just to share an example, you talk to any salesperson and ask him to give you an outlook. He will give you an outlook maybe of 100 crores. But when you ask him to give a forecast, for production, it will end up with 300 crores. Because his fear is always that, I may not get material. And if you tell him, okay, where is the difference? Then they will start working on it. So that's the type of accountability I'm talking about.
Only to the, I'll come to you. We are running really short on time here. And the audience wants lunch, probably. That's what meditation says. Coming to the second question, can demand sensing replace traditional planning more? So I want to ask, can real-time data replace historical data?
I think one thing we'd just like to add from the earlier question, and just to come back on the question which you asked, is that demand sensing can be applied across all the channels? Probably no. And there is a lot of channel proliferation happening, because gone are the days, we used to have a general trade, in the balance of FMCG sector. The general trade used to be the biggest component of our, of the channel sales. Now with the emerging channels like e-commerce, cash and carry, modern trade, institution, CSD, CPCM, you name it. And I don't think you can have a single line strategy to have a demand sensing. I think demand sensing can always be done. First of all, the word sense means you can do only short-term sensing. You cannot do long-term projection from them, and you need to do only short-term sensing from the channels where you can collect data. If you don't get that data, then you cannot sense. Second bit is that when you're talking about forecasting, what are you trying to forecast? You're trying to forecast what is your selling from your warehouse to your customer, which is typically a distributor or probably a subsidiary who is actually holding more inventory, or probably you're directly doing servicing to your customer. And I don't think any of the panel currently is working on D2C model, which is a direct to consumer, which means that every intermediary is holding some bit of inventory. And at every inventory level, every distributor who is holding some bit of inventory, he is trying to build some kind of a buffers in his system. I think we need to remove that bias. I think what sensing is going to use, or what technology is going to come to the help, is that remove those silo working and remove those biases from the system. I think that is what the sense will really help us, and technology is going to be the aiding factor over there. I don't think human intervention can do that.
So yeah, just to build on that, the question was that can demand sensing replace demand planning? So you have to understand that what demand sensing aims to do. Demand sensing is more from a short-term perspective, where you are trying to respond to the customer and the consumer preferences. Demand planning is a more long-term planning, in the sense that you are trying to understand what will help you cater to the consumer demand. And demand planning can take insights from demand sensing, but it also involves a lot of collaborative inputs which come from sales, which comes from marketing, it comes from the company's overall strategy. So I would rather say that demand sensing is a subset of demand planning. You take insights from demand sensing to build into your demand planning, you feed it into your system. But demand planning has a much more longer term role to play in the organization, and it has a more holistic view in terms of the cross-functional collaboration.
Thank you, Anandita, for answering the question. Now the questions will take an interesting turn. But let me start with a very boring question. How capital intensive is demand sensing?
Okay. Hello. Yeah. So I think most of the panelists already spoke about what demand sensing and how it is going to be replaced to the demand planning as a process. Definitely, I agree to the other panelists that it's not going to be replaced completely. It's more like enabling the long-term plan to short-term plans. And if you read the subject demand sensing, it's a very tech intense solution where a lot of methodology, a lot of technology is supposed to be involved to get the better outcome of the demand sensing. And if you see the prerequisite, that defines how investment is required. Is it something possible to implement for every set of organization? The success of demand sensing comes from the capturing of the as much as demand signals or as much as the supply chain signals, and those signals capture is required in the ecosystem. And when you're talking about the ecosystem, you need a synchronized supply chain. Otherwise, the demand sensing outcome would be only as a forecast, like other traditional or other historical methodology what we do follow. Yes, the answer is to make it very simple and to sort. It's definitely an intense exercise, but it is just in one time. It's just an initiative intense, and more than capital intense or more than an investment to the something to the working capital. I think more important is the change management and the believing in the subject of the demand sensing. And most of today in the scenarios, at least from the side where we do see from a service partner or service providers, is that the belief of the subject or demand sensing is something industry has to be still matured, especially in the Indian context. We do still believe the collaboration more on the demand sensing, but the investment, all kind of these data signals, the business signals require a lot of beliefs, investment to those beliefs. And once we start delivering those, I think the yield in the subsequent years and the subsequent period of time would be definitely multiplicative, and it's going to be create more value to the entire process of design.
Now, most sensors provide us with singular or binary data, but humans have 6 to 7 senses. Can we leverage this capability of humans to sense data?
I can take a stab on that. So I think the idea of having a demand sensing piece is to gather as much as possible market intelligence. Okay, and this is specific not only at a national level, it could be specific onto a particular geography, in particular region as well. And also in FMCG parlance, it will have its own implications on the channels and the retail environments which we are talking about. Now, as an individual, I have 6 senses, right? But is it possible for someone like me to talk to those set of geographical constraints and figure out what exactly is going to be my product mix for a short-term period? That may be really difficult for somebody to do that. And that is why we are more reliant on having data which will give us those set of insights, which is a derivative of the demand sensing. Now, coming to how do we get that data? There is a long chain of, I will say, investments which will be required, both at the retail level as well as the channel level. Because in Indian parlance, even today, while we are talking a lot about e-commerce and direct trade customers, majority of the business still is coming from traditional trade or what we call as wholesalers. And over there, getting that data is going to be really difficult for us.
And I'll just take a minute here. Let's look at how big this animal is in the Indian context, right? I belong to CPG industry. Normally, an evolved CPG player would operate with 1,500 to 2,000 distributors who then service around 7 lakh, 8 lakh, 10 lakh outlets. Right? You're talking of capturing point of sale data for these outlets. Then you are looking at real-time data coming in from point of sale from modern trade accounts and e-commerce accounts. Right? Then you are looking at integrating early warning systems coming from macro data. Right? So the quantum of data that we are talking is insane. And to make sense out of all this data, intelligence has to be built in at the right level, which will involve technology, which is not possible without it. Now, what is it that we are saying on the process side? We are saying we don't want to live in a place or a time frame wherein we refresh the demand on a monthly basis, go back and come back after a month. We are saying we want systems which are intelligent enough to identify outliers and correct for those on an ongoing basis. Right? In the morning discussion, autonomous planning was defined as the end state that we want to go to. So again, if we want to influence that and integrate that as a process state and integrated and autonomous planning led by exceptions handling, technology will play a major role there.
I think just to simply answer your question, all the senses can be sensed? My answer is definitely can be sensed as long as it is digitized. But I don't think we can digitize our process of feeling something. If you look back to the history, I think we're talking about the sensing, but the entire Delphi method of forecasting was actually nothing but we are sensing only. So one more element which is very important to understand is that who is going to own this sense data? A demand planner cannot individually sense it because he will be chewed and probably he will be thrown out of the company in case he kind of bakes in that particular information and goes give it to the supply planner to do the supply planning, because everything has to be a consensus driven number. And the moment you try to make a decision which is completely dependent upon technology, and technology is just probably giving you some idea and from indicators which is fetching from the market. And talking about the investment which you talked about, I think that it is definitely, as on today, it's a very capital intensive expense because the technology is a little rare at this moment. It is soon catching up the economies of scale. But I'm sure in the next 5 to 10 years, the cost will come down as more and more companies kind of start adapting the new technology. I think there will be a lot of abundance of the data scientists and as well as the coders who will be doing the entire the solution design. So I think at this moment it is expensive, and it depends upon how many connectors are you building to gather those signals, and how much of exogenous and endogenous information are you baking into the entire forecasting process. Otherwise, it's pretty much all your SAP APO can take care of all this internal data point.
One additional thing I think which Shrey had just mentioned was, and I think Gyan also mentioned as part of the capital intensive piece. So when we talk about capital demand sensing being capital intensive, I think we look at it only on the demand side of it. When we are looking at demand sensing, I think the utilization part of it on the back end of the supply chain is equally important. So what if demand sensing is, and I implement demand sensing at my end, and Gyan can correlate with me because he has done a short exercise for both of it, but I cannot replicate whatever data is coming to my end at the back end. Ultimately, whatever data is coming at the front end is of no use. So even if I am giving demand, so for HUL, for example, works on a 10-day period, but if my inventory planning is at a monthly period, it is useless. So ultimately, everything has to correlate to demand, everything has to subside to demand. The constraint has always to be the demand and the frequency at which the demand is.
This brings me to another interesting question. How important is supply chain design to obtain the data and to deploy the market?
So maybe I'll start and then others can take over. I think when we're looking at demand sensing, I think it should be both in terms of when we're looking at designing frequency, the entire supply chain side of it, we would need to decide on two key aspects. One is the serviceability of it, and the other part is cost to serve. So when we're looking at designing, say, supply chain basis demand sensing, how quickly can we incorporate that input to, say, my production planning, then to the factory, then to the RMPM. And I think that is where the overbalance in the overbalance of demand sensing, the overall supply chain needs to subside to whatever period for which I am forecasting. If my supply chain design cannot sort of adjust to that cycle, ultimately demand sensing has to sort of talk in alignment with what my supply chain can adjust to.
So I think adding to what he said, the supply chain design needs to be very robust because demand sensing is for a short term. So it should be adaptable to taking changes as early as possible, taking corrective actions, and at the same time dependability on too many factors should be reduced because that's the key to it. But today it's an integrated system. So we depend on many factors, but we need to pick up which are the key factors which will give us 80 to 90% of our results. We cannot say that I have to look for everything. So pick up those 70 to 80% in your design and see it is robust that changes can be adapted as early as possible.
So I would like to divide this question or my answer in two perspectives. One about how your supply chain design, and another is how your business is designed or your portfolio is designed. Where you have more complex or more proliferated profile of your products or your distribution channels. That's where you would expect a lot of different signals to make your demand sensing solution is successful. I think that is one of the key important piece. So the more lean structure is always enable a better demand sensing from a business structure point of view. Similarly, in terms of the network or your supply chain flow structure point of view, the more demand or order points are minimized, the better demand sensing performances happen always. Because the window is only 6 weeks, the past 6 weeks and versus future 6 weeks. And all your demand forecasting where you do the traditional of last 3 years, 5 years data point, you zero down to 6 weeks period of time. And you don't want to keep your demand sensing outcome as an isolated. The reason being is that this has to go to your entire supply chain till the end network. So to speed up all this, I think you need to be a very lean and I'm not saying that it's a prerequisite, but for a successful demand sensing outcome, the ideal structure to be more lean, more agile, and more resilient to make a better outcome of the demand sensing.
I think the key piece over here is the agility of the supply chain to respond to the demand sensing inputs which they are getting. Now, in what we have seen in pre-COVID has been that lot many of the supply chains have been largely global, where there's very limited production capabilities within the same region or within the same country. And that is where probably even after you get the demand sensing signals, your ability to respond to those signals gets severely impacted. And post-COVID, what we have also seen, especially in the FMCG and the CPG industry, is that supply chain designs are now moving more towards locally made and locally sourced, rather than be dependent on some other country or some other continent from which the products are getting sourced. So that's where it really helps to have a better agility in terms of getting the production done locally.
Just to build on it, I think someone from the audience asked a question, I believe someone from Unilever, is that let's define the problem statement first before defining the solution. And I think the entire supply chain design will always depend upon what is the problem statement which you're trying to address. If the problem statement is that we need to service our customer faster, then you need a little more agile system. If you need as if your problem statement is that we need to protect our margins, so then you need a little more of a kind of a reactive supply chain system. They're not you are reacting because you are doing all bulk production. So I think the entire supply chain design, I don't think there's a straight answer to it. It has to be segmented in terms of what channel, which customer you want to apply, what kind of a design you need to make, what is your go-to-market model as far as supply chain is concerned. I think everything will have to be looked into a different perspective, a different segmentation have to be done. And then supply chain strategy have to then prioritize, okay, which channel, which particular geography you're going to target, and what is the growth coming in from which channel and which geography. I think that is where the crux is, and that is what going to define your supply chain model. Otherwise, I don't think there is any supply chain model which can really fit into all the priorities of the business.
The scope of demand sensing today is very limited. Do you see an increase in the scope of demand sensing in the future?
Yes, I mean in a short way to answer that question, yes, the scope of demand sensing will go up. And I think we've already started seeing that in many other industries. So if I don't look at CPG and FMCG, where we are still dominated by general trade, especially in India. If you look at other industries like e-commerce, Amazon, even going a little out of the box, the OTT platforms like Netflix and all, they have started using demand sensing to build on their inventory. So, and we all know how Amazon, Flipkarts of the world use big data in a very robust manner to understand what the consumers want and what the consumers prefer. So it is just a matter of time before it percolates down to the rest of the industries. It will take time. It will also need, as the panelists have pointed out, it will need a lot of capital. But yes, we will have to move to demand sensing, because with the generations changing, the brand loyalty is no more what it used to be, 5 years down, 5 years back. Consumer preferences are changing, and we need to be ready to respond to those consumer preferences in the same manner.
I think one additional thing which will change is, and something which Nimish pointed out, is that, and I might be restricted to the FMCG CPG industry, as you pointed out, that a lot of the new channels have already started. And by the scope of it, they've started capturing the point of sale data. Unfortunately, in the FMCG industry, since it is dominated by the traditional trade, we do not have the ability to capture the point of sale data. I think one important point which is going to come up as we move forward and increase the scope is the quality of the data which is available at the tertiary end. And this is true for all the FMCG organizations. We take into account the secondary data because we don't have the ability, one, to capture the tertiary data. Also, if we do have the ability, the quality of the tertiary data is very poor. So I think when we look at increasing the scope of demand sensing, a lot of these inputs in terms of market shares or in terms of the quality of retail level data that we have at our end would go up. And as it goes up, the organization's confidence on and the reliability on the particular data set is going to go up, and hence the scope is going to go up, is what we feel there is going to happen in the years to come.
And the amount of innovation that can happen in terms of the variables that go into demand sensing, literally there is no bounds, right? There is nothing that's stopping any organization from, let's say, using Google search as an indicator of their demand, or something like a product review on Amazon as an input or a variable into sizing demand. And as and when these variables go into and feed into the demand sensing algorithms, what more and more companies will realize is that this data is a better indicator of how to effectively manage and deploy their spends. Because as they get more and more of consumer data from a customer data, they would get a better visibility of how their actions are influencing the consumer decisions. Right? And I see this getting integrated more and more with the decision-making process of the organization.
I think all of us missed on one point. That is predictive technology, predictive maintenance, predictive consumption. How is this going to affect demand sensing in the future?
Fair, very good point. We do see, I think the demand sensing as a concept is something much relevant and more used in the space of the retail or followed by CPG. I think the predictive consumption is very important as one of the inputs which goes to, or one of the drivers of the predictors of the demand sensing in terms of what could be the footfall in a particular store, or what could be the the window gates at which the sales have happened more. So I think predicting the footfalls also define what could be the consumption at a particular stores. But these all are looks good in terms of to discuss in a panel, but at the fundamentals again is important that how your ecosystem has been built. Do you have such a right infrastructure which captures all these informations? Do you have such technology which converts this information to a meaningful decision-making system, which is nothing but your demand sensing tool or engines? And how you're using out of the DS engine. Personally, I work with different organizations and also implemented in the part of different implementations. What we did definitely realize is that this still remained as an outcome of the forecast. It's another line of another forecast. But how you're going to use that forecast to make that last goal of the organization, which is nothing but make a valuability improvement in the sort of goals, it's still yet to be evaluated rightly by all the leadership team.
Demand sensing is a promising technology, but it needs to be seen if it can expand the range of possibility to use human senses and predictive technology to deliver better outcomes and help predict future realities. I would like to end the session with a story. I saw a coffee machine. It used to weigh the amount of coffee in the machine, and when the weight was closer to zero, it used to indicate the company that this coffee machine is going to run out of coffee. Is that not a way to sense demand?